Welcome to Attention Needed, where we dive deep into the world of artificial intelligence and its implications for our future. I'm Victor Bian, Chief Operating Officer of HydroX AI and host of this show. Today, we're thrilled to welcome Dean Wampler, IBM's Chief Technical Representative to the AI Alliance, a new organization co-launched by IBM, Meta, and dozens of other organizations that promotes open, safe, and responsible AI. Dean has led AI-focused engineering teams at IBM Research on a variety of projects, including the watsonx platform engineering team. He is also a co-chair of the AI Alliance Trust and Safety Workgroup, along with Meta's Joe Spisak, who we had the honor of interviewing in our inaugural episode. In this episode, we'll be discussing the key topic of innovating and building AI in the open. We'll hear Dean share his perspective on what open AI innovation means, the roles and responsibilities of various stakeholders, and the importance of addressing safety and security issues. We hope you find this discussion as insightful and helpful as we do. Hey, Dean.
Hey, Victor. Good to see you again.
Good to see you again. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, let's jump in. First of all, what does open mean in AI innovation? Why do you think this is so important?
Yeah, I think the beauty of it is it's trying to accomplish in AI the kind of successes that we experienced in the history of open source software, where you get a lot of eyes on stuff, a lot of contributions. You also make it easier for people to use things. And in general, you end up with much better quality. I think Linux is a great example of doing something in the open, actually created the world's best operating system that we all rely on, at least for server-side stuff. So that's why I'm excited about open in the context of AI, but it's not easy to do it either.
What do you think the ultimate state of open AI innovation looks like? Tell us about what the end game looks like for this.
Yeah, it's a really good question because, if we look at the way things are today, we've got a couple of challenges, one of which is it takes enormous amounts of compute to do at least the bigger models, and even really high quality smaller models just take a lot of data, a lot of CPU or GPU time, I guess, mostly. And not everybody has access to that, even people who would like to collaborate in the open. The other problem I've been thinking a lot about lately is the murkiness of the data sets that we're using. There's so many data sets out there that, have lots of good data, but it's not clear if we really have license to use them or where they came from or, that kind of stuff. So I think to get to the ultimate view would be we can actually develop state-of-the-art, best-in-class models, in some shared capacity, in some shared way, and that we have really rigorous, comprehensive data sets that with very clear license to use rules and governance and so forth, so that when we say something is open source, which traditionally has meant everything from the beginning of whatever it is that you use to build software, we can't really say that right now about most models because of this data problem in part, but I hope we'll get to the point where we really are building state-of-the-art models completely in the open, where somebody could literally, if they have the resources at least, do the build from scratch themselves, giving all the things that they need being freely available.
I see. For those listeners that are unfamiliar with AI Alliance, obviously, I think a lot what you described, getting people together to work on open source projects to contribute to eventually an open AI ecosystem or innovation ecosystem. Maybe share in a couple of sentences an overview what this organization is, as well as what kind of purpose this organization serves in the greater landscape of open AI innovation.
Yeah, sure. The Alliance was formed last year by 50 organizations led by Meta and IBM, and it really was kind of with this vision of working in the open is actually better for everyone. Honestly, it was partly a reaction to this problem where it seemed that a lot of the state of the art was limited to some very well capitalized commercial entities. And of course, there's always going to be a balance of commercial and open source. I'm not criticizing that by itself. But it felt like there was a risk that this potentially transformative technology would not be widely acceptable. So it's really built on the philosophy of let's do as much as we can in the open, recognizing that everybody has to make money. Part of the ways you've always made money in open source is maybe the core capabilities are open, but then the problem of how it's all integrated and tested and supported and serviced is done as a commercial offering. I think that'll still be the case here. But the Alliance is trying to make sure that first, as much as we can, we build the whole technology environment in the open, not just models and data sets, but also, the agent frameworks and all this. But then also that we think seriously about the risks that are presented by AI, that we attack those very vigorously, that we provide expert guidance to funding, or I should say regulatory agencies that have to decide, what should we not allow and what should we allow, which is part of the mission of the Alliance is, the policy and regulatory concerns and advocating for those. And then also education. How do we educate the public to know how to use this effectively, safely, and so forth? How do we educate developers to build tools that are effective, safe, and so forth? So it's all of those sort of things under one umbrella in the Alliance.
That's very fascinating. You mentioned about education, resource constraints, the type of power, the type of kind of resources that need to go into, I would say, training of a model, data set access, policies. Those are all kind of potentially kind of constraints and barriers that, people need to knock down in order to actually truly innovate AI in the open ecosystem. I guess what's really fascinating to us when HydroX AI first got the opportunity to join the AI Alliance, the whole design of it was around 6 key focus areas and centering around kind of 3 major pillars. One is knowledge spreading, the other is technical initiatives, and finally, increasing access. I mean, what is the rationale of this design? Maybe, again, kind of sort of going back to those barriers that we need to knock down. But I'd be curious to hear from the very get-go when you design, or when IBM, Meta, and the original 50 organizations that started designing this alliance, what were some original rationale there, and how were you guys envisioning this at the beginning? And certainly right now, after a year into this process.
Yeah, I have to say, I think the 6 have held up pretty well. We haven't said, "Oh, that was a mistake," or "We completely forgot about this." In part because they were designed to be fairly general and broad in scope. I mentioned 2 already, of course, which is policy and advocacy, and also education. Those are 2 of the 6 focus areas, and the other 4 are more technical. The one that I co-lead and that we've been working together with you all on is trust and safety. And I got involved in this not because I'm an expert in trust and safety, but I knew that this is one of those table stakes. If you cannot trust that the system is actually going to work for your goals, if you can't trust it to be safe to use, then it's just never going to be used. And so, to me, this was table stakes for AI, and I'm glad to be part of helping see that to fruition, I guess. The next one is just general applications and tooling, thinking about where the gaps. There's obviously just a ton of open source tooling out there. The Lang chains, the llama indexes, you can, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. But where are things missing? Maybe part of it is helping people understand the current state of the art of thinking about application design, providing guidance about what does work. If you're going to do a RAG pattern or whatever, how should you actually implement it to be successful? So that work group kind of focuses on these kind of general areas of what sort of expert guidance can we provide the industry, and also where are gaps that we could maybe help fill. The next focus area is really about hardware portability, which is an interesting problem where, we have obviously one very dominant player on the hardware front, and that's NVIDIA, who has, done extremely well providing the just massive amount of compute that's required for a lot of model training. But it would be nice if we had alternatives for competitive reasons, as well as sometimes what you actually need in a certain scenario may not be the best fit for an NVIDIA GPU, let's say, like you're trying to run on a device like a phone, or you just want a less expensive, but maybe not as high performance version of an accelerator that's good enough for your needs. So that work group is really thinking about the hardware landscape and how do we make sure that the software stacks on top of it make it relatively easy for developers to move to the right runtime platform for whatever needs that they may have. And then the last of the technical work groups is really about models and data sets. Now, obviously, a lot of people are building models, including open access models. What we've tried to do in this group is to think about underserved areas like time series, science, and other domain-specific models. What about data sets that are needed to make those work? And in particular, we've recently launched a project to attack that one problem I mentioned at the beginning of data sets tend to have murky provenance and poor governance, and hence people are reluctant to talk about the models they're using, out of fear of potential legal liability or something. What can we do to make it possible for people to say, if a data set fits these criteria, then it's completely safe to use, legal, blah, blah, blah. And what would those data sets be? What's the catalog of those data sets? So that's the sort of thing that we think it's a good example, and all of these others I mentioned too, of things that are best done in the open by a community of people working together, as opposed to one organization that can just maybe spearhead something in particular, maybe proprietary at first. Eventually, it might become a global open standard or something like that.
Cool. Speaking of the community, obviously looking at the AI Alliance, there is a wide array of institutions and individual contributors. I think the number of members certainly has grown quite a bit, I would say, since the very inception. So what roles and responsibilities do you see startups playing in this open ecosystem? And on the contrary, how do you think about the more mature, more established large incumbents?
Yeah, startups have always been great as being kind of the real sort of early explorers into a space that has been unexplored. Like some really interesting idea that they can explore without a lot of encumbrances that you might find in a larger organization. As long as they can get the funds to do it, they often find a way forward in some way that no one else had thought of or hadn't really thought of pursuing, and hence create next generation innovations. A classic example, of course, from the old days is Microsoft and personal computers as a viable alternative to larger computer systems that were the standard back in the 70s, for example. So I do think that as far as like the alliance goes, we have a number of startups who are members, and I'm very cognizant of the fact that they are working very hard. They don't have infinite resources to do other things besides their core mission. But we try to make sure we enable them in whatever way we can to find collaborators, find other ways of sharing ideas, and get the word out about what they're doing among other people within the alliance and then the community at large, to hopefully scratch each other's backs in a sense, help them to succeed, but also help the rest of the industry propel them forward as they're exploring unexplored spaces and what we need to be doing.
Do you see a difference in incentive, for example, between a startup joining the AI Alliance versus the incumbents kind of joining the AI Alliance? And as one of the key facilitator of this community, how do you kind of play a role in facilitating innovation as well as collaboration with these two sides of the forces?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in general, because I'm not the boss of anybody, I can't just say I want you guys to work on X, right? So it's all about inspiring people, motivating them to actually do something, and then also thinking very hard about what's the sort of win-win situation here. What would be compelling for HydroXAI or anyone else to be involved in that both benefits you and benefits everybody else? So usually for the startups, I think it's partly getting more visibility into the community, maybe more awareness of what other people are doing in ways that they may not have through other channels of information, connecting with other people, including large organizations that might fund the work, buy the services, maybe even acquire the company at some point. So I think it's a way for them to grow and expand, to get the word out, and also to bring their unique perspective and technology before more people, especially since most of the members of the Alliance are very actively building AI systems. It's good for them to hear about things that they maybe not would find very useful that they might not have heard about otherwise. As far as the larger companies, if you think about people like Meta, for example, they're going to be very concerned about making sure that AI is used responsibly and really, benefits their, communities in their various properties. That they obviously have this tough job of balancing, freedom of speech versus, things that maybe aren't such great speech, but what do you shut down? What do you prevent? How do you get people able to find the information they want, to find the communities they want? So it's in their interest to be a leader in making sure that AI really does work well for the kinds of businesses that they have. For a company like IBM, we have a history of taking often rough technology and making it viable for enterprises to trust and use. We played a huge role in Linux becoming the thing that it is today in just the same way. I think also Java, it turns out we were, way back in the day, a big influencer in the adoption of Java. And that's what we're doing now. We know our customers really well. We know the kind of problems that enterprises are worried about, like risk, legal exposure, customer satisfaction, cost reduction, and so forth. And so we can really focus a lot of energy on making sure that AI bridges the gap from this really cool technology to something that actually practically solves problems like those folks have.
That's all very exciting. I'd love to actually come back to the IBM piece a little bit more for the listener of this show for sure, because I think it's a very interesting organization, and obviously in the AI Alliance, it's one of the founding members. Love to kind of dive a little bit deeper into that in a little bit. But first, I love to kind of focus on the technical side of AI innovation a little bit, particularly on generative AI. What are some of the inherent challenges or technical challenges you see with this particular technology? I would say for the interest of this show's audiences, we'd be curious to hear if you think any of these challenges or concerns on this technology are trust or safety related.
Yeah, they are. There are some there. I mean, a few I'll just mention in passing that are probably not unfamiliar to people. Obviously, cost. We mentioned that these things typically require expensive hardware to run. And that has been a blocker that anecdotally I've heard of projects that look promising in the proof of concept phase, but never made it to production because the cost model just didn't seem to be viable for the project. As far as trust and safety, yes, there's a lot of concerns about if I put this chatbot in front of people, is it going to use hate speech? Is it going to engage in very odd things with conversations, or is it going to stay focused on the mission of whatever it is to do? I'm kind of excited with some of the work I've seen in some very focused areas of designing chatbots, for example, which I consider a really hard problem to get right, that are very, very focused, very highly tuned and trained to be just laser focused on specific use cases that people need. IBM has had a great experience actually doing this with automating some of our HR processes that turn out to be so commonly done that they're actually a significant expense for our HR teams to handle. And we've trained, very customized models to not only make it easier and automated to do those tasks without human intervention, but it turns out they've also improved the end user experience with employees using this feature. I've heard other examples of medical chatbots that do very specific things like, patient follow-up about your prescriptions after you've left the hospital, but isn't going to go beyond that and knows by training not to go beyond that remit, if you will. So anyway, riffing a little bit, but I think bridging the gap from these models that can do all kinds of crazy things to things that are within the bounds of control that we need, I think is one of the biggest challenges right now. We're figuring out ways to do it, often with very brute force methods, like very extensive tuning of an existing model, for example. As a developer, a longtime developer, I'm very interested in developer testing, and a real problem we have is we're used to things that run deterministically. It's not quite correct because when you put something in a distributed context, you never have guaranteed order of certain things. But all the problems of non-determinism that we faced before have been well characterized and relatively easy to handle. But now when you've got this non-deterministic model right in the middle of your app, and it's right in the middle because you're trying to build something new that's never been done before, where it's the center of the capabilities that you're building. Man, how do you test that? How do you really know that that chatbot is going to stay on its mission and not deviate and not swear at people? There's a lot of challenges there. So I think those are kind of interesting problems that we have to solve. And then the problem of making things economical, which I think there's a lot of progress here already with smaller models that, again, are focused on a core use case, let's say, and hence are much less expensive to run than, say, a very large model like a GPT-4 or a Llama 405B, that kind of thing.
So speaking of taking on these challenges, I mean, all of these challenges you've outlined here, for companies that are building innovative tools or companies that are trying to innovate in this space, what are some of the existing resources, both open and proprietary, that are available to them based on your understanding?
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting thing to think about. And if I can step back to the pre large language model era, I remember back in like the 90s when the internet first started, where if you wanted to do like an internet company, you had to get enough venture capital to buy like server hardware and expertise about every aspect of running a website, the security, the user management, the hardware management. And then fast forward to, let's say 5 years ago or something before we really got sort of taken over by large language models, you could get rid of almost all of that, especially in a startup context with cloud services. You could do almost everything with very little capital. Now we've sort of pivoted or transitioned into this large language model world where all that is still true, but we've got these very expensive models that we want to maybe do some research, whether we're in a research, pure research context like a university, or we're really trying to push the envelope on an idea in a startup that could, pay out big. We can still do a lot of that in the cloud environments. Resources are available. They're kind of expensive still. But I think what people are finding is a couple of things. One is being clever about working in smaller increments, like testing out an idea with a smaller model to see if it's actually progressing as you go to maybe slightly bigger models. Does it actually seem to be going in the right direction, where if you go to the target size you're expecting, it's actually going to work the way you expect it to? Some sophisticated behavior, let's say. Again, open source, leveraging that extensively, figuring out what we can offload from the model to other systems. Like, do you really have to have the model do the mathematics, or could you send the math part, whatever that is, to some math package that's been doing math deterministically for a long time? I'm kind of riffing on a bunch of ideas, but I think people are learning to be clever, to work with the resources they have, to experiment with ideas in a smaller context first before putting up money or getting resources for larger experiments that might be necessary to actually prove that the idea is going to work, especially in a production context. But anyway,
I think you're touching
sort of
on a couple of really interesting points here, actually. One is kind of, is bigger always better regarding models? The other question is also, do you necessarily see this transformer-based model being the future of all AI, or what we kind of typically call the AGI? I'm curious to hear your perspective on both. Is bigger always better? And second of all, like, what are your stance on AGI, as well as, is transformer-based model going to win it all compared to other, I would say, AI ML?
Yeah, really good questions. I think we are figuring out that for those focused use cases, I can really live with a very small model, and we're getting better and better at training with more data to make the models smaller and smaller with equivalent, acceptable performance, whatever that means. So a lot of the chatbots, like this HR scenario that I alluded to earlier, doesn't need to be running ChatGPT. It doesn't need to know how to write poetry or, just whatever other thing you can think of. So that's a good place where the very small models, especially if I want this to actually run on, say, a phone, that's where they can actually thrive. I'll mention one other little technical detail that I've seen a lot of discussion of. There's a mixture of experts. There's even modular architectures, which the iPhone I know uses, where if I'm about to do like face recognition, I'll plug in this little module on top of a core module to give it the extra expertise it needs to recognize faces, and strip it out when it's actually doing like text completion, that sort of thing. Lots of interesting tricks for reducing, working in the small, but still getting the capabilities. I forget what the rest of the question was. I kind of riffed on that.
The other question is probably much bigger and more philosophical to a certain degree. How do you feel about this world of AGI, or the end game of AGI that a lot of people have been describing? And also, do we really believe transformer-based model is the end-all be-all?
Yeah, those are really interesting. I think for AGI, what's interesting to me about it, first of all, I'm not really that worried about the doomsday matrix scenario or anything like that. I kind of have the sense that we'll manage to stay in control enough. If we don't do something stupid like hook up an unregulated model to like the controls of a nuclear plant or something so that it could actually blow it up or whatever. If we don't do dumb things, if we're careful about applications in like combat contexts, I think we'll probably be okay. What I think is interesting about AGI is there is a tendency in humanity over a very, very long time of comparing whatever the state of the art of some technology is to the human brain. I mean, we've been doing this since, like when the water wheel was invented, clocks, is like, we've invented something that works like the brain. Now, of course it doesn't. It wasn't anything like a human brain. And I feel like now, even though it feels closer to a human brain and it's sort of inspired by real neural networks, it's so different, and especially in the way it behaves, that I think that we can be deceived by this facility with language or facility with images to think that it's actually thinking. Now, of course, there are some real experts who would say that, yes, we are actually getting close to that, and I certainly respect their opinions. I'm a little less confident that we're actually that close, as long as we're careful about what these can do. And maybe one of the reasons is, you mentioned the transformer architecture. We're not entirely sure that that's a good representation of what an AGI neural network should actually be. But we've also created this interesting situation where so much has been built now that's aimed at that architecture. Tremendous optimizations, runtimes for training and inference that assume that architecture, and even custom silicon now that's being built to implement some of these algorithms in silicon. It makes it actually harder to replace it. I mean, there are some other models that have emerged, like I think Mamba is one of them, that could very well be better, but we've almost boxed ourselves in to enable something new by our dependence and assumptions about transformers as the core architecture. So I think that's an interesting question. Will we actually abandon that at some point for something else? And we'll see.
We'll see, I think, in a couple years of time as we continue to develop this technology, as more use cases start to kind of, I guess, fall in place. I guess speaking of use cases, and I want to kind of go back to IBM a little bit. I think IBM as a company has an impeccable track record of working with some of the largest companies in the world. Could you tell us a bit about what IBM has done or built to help its customers address these, the issues that are coming up or have come up in terms of adopting Gen AI? The whole, for these questions that we discussed, I think a lot of it was around, some of the concerns, some of the issues, challenges we saw with this non-deterministic nature of this technology, or the creative nature, depending on how you view it. It could be a good thing. It could also be a bit of a challenge when you deploy in an environment which requires deterministic thinking or outcome. I'm curious, tell us a little bit more about IBM, and also how it's particularly helping its enterprise customer base. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. I think there's some really interesting examples of where IBM's enterprise focus and history are starting to bear fruit in terms of again, bridging that gap between this very raw technology on one side and all the concerns that an enterprise has. Our commercial offering is called Watson X, and it's inspired by the name Watson that we've used for a while for AI technology. And one of the capabilities, or I guess you'd call it that, is watsonx.governance, we call it, which is really addressing this problem of enterprises really do need to keep careful watch over what data is used for what purposes, where it came from, what's its provenance. Models are effectively data in this regard too. So are we tracking carefully the models that have been trained in a certain way, especially when we're doing experiments? Did we actually grab the version of the model that we tuned that's actually the best version for this particular app? And it turns out this product, which sounds kind of mundane, but is a core requirement for a lot of enterprises, has got a lot of traction for that reason. And I think also our awareness of the risk profiles that companies have, what they care about, their concerns about not deploying something that is half-baked, that will undermine their reputation or whatever, also has allowed like our consulting teams to keep projects sort of scoped to not be too ambitious, but to solve problems incrementally, and build confidence that the technology is actually going to work. And if it's not proving that it's going to work, then to back off before it becomes something in production that's a problem. So I think it's just a lot of that enterprise awareness, thinking about enterprise problems. And then and the other one I'll just mention, because we've talked about it, like trust and safety is obviously very important, and trying to make sure that the expertise that actually is very deep at IBM for trust and safety is also brought to bear. So people really do feel confident that these models will stay aligned in every sense to their mission that you've intended them for. So it's actually working out pretty well for us so far. And I think it's because we really understand what people need in enterprises to make things actually work.
We covered a lot of ground today, a lot of topics, a lot of aspects of generative AI, AI Alliance. But before I close out on this discussion, I typically like to ask my guests to name one thing they're most excited about this Gen AI, as well as one thing they're most unsure about this technology. So tell us yours.
Yeah, I thought about this a little bit recently, and I had some ideas of saying, oh, I'm very excited about how models are getting smaller and still working. But actually, what I'm most excited about is just hearing some stories I didn't expect to hear about people who are figuring out how to get past the concerns for security, for safety, for alignment, and build things that I thought probably wouldn't really be viable in the near term, like chatbots you could actually use in a medical, healthcare kind of context, because people are putting in the work to actually figure out how to make them work effectively, and knowing when to what would you say, disengage and bring in an actual human to interact with the patient or whatever. That kind of stuff where people are doing the hard work, figuring out how to actually make it work now rather than waiting for all these problems to be solved that we can list. That to me is the most exciting, because I think it shows that despite all of the sort of grandiose talk about AI taking over the world, that actually things are getting done to make it real. And it's often the way things often are, people doing the legwork, in the dark, in the corner, figuring out how to make something happen, and then it'll spread from there. So that's exciting.
What about the concerns?
Yeah, I think, I'm not too worried about the Matrix scenario, but I've already heard stories about people reducing staff or reducing hiring because either they think that AI will replace the people that they needed previously, or they've actually demonstrated that they don't actually need them as much. This is, of course, an old story with technology. One of the reasons people have often opposed technology and mills, automated mills versus, knitting yourself or whatever, was for fear of losing jobs. And the counter argument has been, well, by greater efficiencies here will open up new opportunities over there for new careers, new options, and so forth. I hope that's true here, but I am a little concerned that there's definitely going to be pressure on creative people, even people working in regular corporations, that there'll be less need for humans for some things. And will we actually be able to absorb them into other stuff? That's just a concern.
It's interesting that certain people believe we cannot get there faster, but also at the same time, there are people that, should also say, let's also pause a little bit and think about the impact and if we're getting there in the right way. So It's fascinating how this industry is panning out. Well, thank you for the time today, Dean. It's great discussing with you. We love to have you back sometime in the future.
I really enjoyed talking with you today, Victor. I'd be happy to come back, and I've really enjoyed working with you and HydroX in the AI Alliance.